Hello. So, post World War II, Bretton Woods Agreement, very common theme. There was this concept of making the US dollar the global reserve currency. And there was one element that a lot of people overlook. And that element is the subsidy that the US employed to get everyone back to prosperity. And you ever played a video game before? In that video game where you have like those attributes you have to allocate to strength, charisma, intellect, what have you. In order to be a successful country historically, you needed to have it be that you had a military, you had the means to grow food, you needed access to either some sort of technology or means for production, you had to have a functional economy, you had to have certain requirements like demographic infrastructure. I mean, you had to have social cohesion, so an identity. But after World War II, two elements of that were completely eliminated. And a lot of people don't understand how much of a subsidy that really is. If if you have a country, for example, like I don't know, Russia, who based its entire identity on having a strong military, having to expand its borders so that it can reduce the amount of actual borderland that it had to secure because of how large the border, the mileage across their borders are. If you suddenly remove that element of their economical cost because they no longer have to subsidize a military or create a military, they don't have to have a navy. Uh, Countries like the Great Britain or the UK, when they were basically ruling the globe for hundreds of years, the reason why they could do so is they brought the most powerful navy, which did two things. It secured all trade between them and all the colonies that they possessed, and also had made sure that there was really nobody who could even approach them. If you remove that element from an economy, if you make it so that that's no longer a requirement, all those resources, all that capital, all those expenditures can be reallocated to either becoming an economic powerhouse or engaging in social welfare programs that make social cohesion stronger. Traditionally, in a world where resources are scarce and finite, the ability to no longer require allocation to a large segment of what composes a country's basic requirements guarantees prosperity. And the second subsidy entailed in Bretton Woods was that the US would guarantee global maritime trade. Humongous subsidy. It cannot be overstated how crazy that subsidy is. It basically is what makes this current world possible. If you have a supply chain for a singular item, say an automotive, like a vehicle, or anything with any sort of complexity at all, if if you change it so that the cost of transport increases by 1% or 10%, it's no longer functional to have a 3,000 person large, 3,000 step large supply chain. It's just not feasible. In that world, you basically have to either localize the demand, meaning you find a way to export locally or within the same country, or that supply chain doesn't exist. One of the reasons why it was so cheap in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s to offshore jobs outside of the US to slaughter the middle income, slaughter the manufacturing, slaughter the unionized class of the US workforce was because it was virtually free to transport things anywhere. Obviously, not true, but on a relative basis, compared to, let's say, 1930s, or in a world that we may be entering, which I would argue we are, where there is no longer any cost that can be paid for certain types of transportation. If even in the most benign type of conflict where China continues to extend their control into the South China Sea, there are regional players, specifically Japan and India, or not India in this case, but the Philippines or Malaysia or Myanmar, less so, Korea, a variety of these players who cannot allow themselves to be boxed in. They cannot allow the South China Sea to be controlled by a player that they've always perceived as hostile. In that world, there is no amount of money that you can throw to enable 3,000, 1,000, 100 step processes for supply chains. And if one part of that supply chain is disrupted, the entirety of that end product is gone. It must be relocated, it must be reallocated. And it has to reallocate in that instance somewhere very proximal or very friendly to the ultimate end consumer. If you consider who is affluent enough and who has the demographic population to support that end consumption, there's only really like 5 or 6 countries in the world that can even theoretically do it, let alone consistently. And they're all Atlantic or Pacific friendly with proximity to the US. the stability of the North American continent, and to some degree the South American continent, but the North American continent, guarantees it access to markets, either to its east through the Atlantic or through the west through the Pacific, that makes it a prime end consumer. And what I will argue till I am blue in the face in this world that we are entering is when you have shifted the global populace into an urbanized setting and forced, because you truly cannot have a child in an 800 square foot apartment in an urban setting. I mean, it's pretty egregious in some places of Canada and the United States, but Shanghai, some cities in Southeast Asia, some cities in Europe, it is absolutely bananas how congested it has become, how incredible it is to survive in a city in terms of your income relative to the amount of money you have to spend on rent and housing. It is impossible to have more than one or two children. And when you have only one child, or if the population averages one and a half, two children, you barely maintain population structure, let alone uh, like try to reform it into the original pyramidal structure it's supposed to be. And without that pyramidal structure, without that large swath of younger cohorts in your sovereign, in your country, in your locale, in your region, you guarantee consumption dies. You can see it today in the figures that China's posting. 10%, 15%, 12%, 8% year over year reductions in consumption of things like automotive vehicles. I mean, that is the prime good. It is as high value add, as high complexity as an item comes. And they're decreasing. Despite the fact that they're becoming more and more affluent, more and more people are being lifted out of poverty from China every year, every month. It's just not true. It's just not feasible to maintain a consumption model without it being localized. Why has it persisted? Some of it's been geopolitical inertia and momentum. Some of it has been there are elements to the status quo that the US intended to preserve, but much of that has been eliminated. I mean, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018 shale revolution basically made it such that the US no longer had the requirement to preserve its own energy imports. Now, do not get me wrong. If something were to happen tomorrow and the US had to, through a presidential decree, disallow exports of US oil goods, it would hurt. It would definitely cause the price of oil and the price of gasoline and all the ultimate plastic and products that come out of the energy, come out of LNG production. It would definitely hurt. But at the end of the day, we could retool. At the end of the day, it would hurt, but it would hurt temporarily. If rare earth minerals and rare earth products were cut off from China, not only do we have a significant stockpile from different production line to production line, ultimately, most of these items aren't particularly rare. Ultimately, places like Greenland have an abundance of the actual elements themselves. Australia, which we have a direct line of sight with, Canada, and a couple of other countries could easily facilitate the exchange of these rare earth minerals. In the early 2010s, when China had threatened Japan and other Southeast Asian countries with an embargo or a ban of the exportation of rare earth minerals, the Japanese were quickly able to retool away from certain types of rare earth minerals. Again, conceptually, it would hurt, but this world is fundamentally being subsidized by the US. If you have to re-enable allocation of resources, 20 or 30% of your GDP away from whatever you currently are allocating it to a navy that can secure supply lines across the world, which would take years, if not decades, to cement. But assuming, if you had to reallocate 15, 20% of your GDP in this 30% pie to ensuring regional stability, because you had to create a military now to secure your borders when you have historically been very insecure with regards to your border conflicts, thinking Germany, thinking Russia, thinking China. Even if you don't have to ultimately defend your borders, the idea that you have to allocate 15% of your GDP to theoretically defend against your borders. Now, some are better positioned than others, but even the more positioned ones, like China, for example, or India, China has had almost entirely of its military buildup be with one intended goal: Taiwan. I mean, you could argue that there are other things they're trying to employ, which is projection of strength locally and regional stability, but they could not engage in all-out war with multiple fronts, which is exactly what would happen under economic duress, mind you. Should they actually engage in a war in any portion of the South China Sea, they would essentially have no oil capacity. If that war involved any sort of regional insecurity for like Japan, They would first and foremost ensure that they were receiving their end goods before any other country was. They would broker the region. Um, Not to be too much on China, but even like, for example, Iran. The reason Iran is able to even export is that the US is creating these dual subsidies that Bretton Woods enabled, which is simply put, you don't need a military. You don't need to worry about your sovereign security. The US will take care of you. A great example of this that you cannot overstate is what happened in the war in Vietnam that the US fought. We were attacking this country for no other reason than to project to the rest of the world. See, we will be our security guarantor. We will act as the security guarantor for the world, and we continue to ensure Vietnamese supplies, Vietnamese trade was not being obstructed. In what world does an all-out warfare type style does the sovereign hegemon, does the hegemon in this conflict, does the superior power go in and guarantee, but don't worry, we're going to disrupt, we're going to attack you directly, we're going to invade your locale, we're going to disrupt your military supply lines, but food, energy imports, allowing your industrial base to continue to export. In what world is that normal? Is that would that even be like conceivable if Russia was the supreme power in its region or on the global stage, and it was engaging in war with Germany or any other country, and saying, "But we'll make sure that Germany can continue to export and import." Well, that's absolutely nuts if you think about it. So while I think people really focus on Bretton Woods when it comes to the financial aspect, specifically on the element that incorporates the US dollar as the reserve currency, where it establishes the gold standard, I tend to think of that as a huge portion. And obviously it's the nail, it's the metaphorical nail in in the contractor's scenario where if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. In the financial world, the global reserve currency is everything. But people don't understand that the reason that that's the case is because of the requirement that the US become the consumer market of first resort so that it can have product dumping en masse from war torn, tattered countries in Europe exchange their goods for those dollars. And the ubiquity of dollars leaving the United States is what enabled the formation of interbank loans denominated in US dollars, the formation of the Eurodollar system. This proliferation occurred because of, again, supply preceding demand. The abundance of dollars led to the price point, the economical point for the existence of that supply that yielded demand for those loans, especially when you start incorporating things like interest rate differentials and the like into the play. But the primary point of this video is try to imagine a world where countries who have no navy, countries who have border insecurity, countries who have had decades of lack of military strengthening, even if they have the resources allocated, like my country, Greece. Greece has an air force. Doesn't mean it's anything optimal. Doesn't mean that the budget that's allocated to the military is actually being utilized in any sort of like appropriate or efficient manner to the actual training of an air force. It's being used to pay off pensions. It's being used to pay off the most inefficient components of the air force as possible. So at the end of the day, try to imagine a world where, and if conflict were to arise, and trade in that locale. And imagine any world, like we're talking like any place. Try to imagine a world where military conflict, kinetic conflict, even just trade conflict, trade dispute, a basic embargo, a basic blockade, because there was some sort of non-adherence to a tariff or a non-adherence to some sort of significant levy or some sort of economic action from one entity to another. Imagine in this scenario, what happens to global trade? The Suez Canal gets blocked for 5 days, and tens of billions of dollars of global production is offline. What happens if that's not reversible or takes weeks or months to reverse? The world ceases to be this efficiency oriented, long supply chain, long distribution chain, long maritime based travel entity. Certain industries just can no longer exist. Things that don't seem possible start to happen. The price of oil spikes like crazy because the supply of oil is no longer existent. The transportational issues cause the oil prices to spike, but the actual end users, the companies that utilize oil, disappear. They have no profit margins. Price spikes, but now their hedges are all destroyed. Their ability to utilize oil becomes gone, like dispersed. So you can actually have a situation where XLE is tanking, WTI is skyrocketing, which is a potential play. No financial advice here, but uh, food insecurity becomes a concern. I mean, you just saw just today, Egypt, Sisi, he enabled or disabled or reduced the subsidy that Egypt employs for wheat. Wheat is one of the most abundant sources of calories to any country. And if you know anything about Egyptian cuisine, it's basically all wheat and rice. The only reason you'd even consider that is because you are struggling financially. And in this region, you're talking about Lebanon has already collapsed. A variety of players in the Middle East have no stability to begin with. Now you're starting to have fringe players like Egypt. The Turkish lira is having Turkish lira is considering to rise as it has been. Consider the subsidy. Really, truly consider it. A lot of people on the internet today will not tell you the reality of the situation, which is that everyone hates the US's involvement in the world. But when the US is no longer involved, people ask where they are. I don't know. I really don't know how else to explain it. I'd love to elaborate some more. Drop a comment, hit that like button, and as always, nuance. Nuance is key. Don't just accept narratives at face value. Have a great night, guys.